Hi weaving friends, I must admit that weaving with 3 heddles on my little Sampleit loom is not my most favourite thing to do. However, I have picked up a few tips and tricks that I want to share with you today that will make it easier. This is a 10-inch Sampleit loom, and one of the main problems with adding extra heddles, very specifically a third heddle, is just the space that you have from the front heddle to the back of the loom. There's just not a lot of space there for introducing an extra heddle. Now they do come with a double heddle block in place, and so for 2 heddles it works out absolutely perfectly. Once you put that third heddle in there, things start to feel pretty squishy. Now I really wanted to weave up this sample on my Sampleit loom. That's what I've got my Sampleit loom for. My other rigid heddle loom is busy at the moment with a class project, and so sometimes when I get inspiration for an idea, I just want to get it on the loom as fast as I can before I lose that enthusiasm for it. And this is a 4-shaft weave, and so I needed to find a way to accommodate those extra shafts. Yes, I could have done a heddle rod and a pickup stick, but I particularly wanted to do 3 heddles because that is my preference. So the first tip that I have for you if you're going to set up your Sampleit or small loom with 3 heddles is make sure it has a double heddle block, and if it doesn't, perhaps you might be able to install one. If you have an older loom, it probably won't have a double heddle block, but if you've purchased in the last few years, it probably will. But the first thing that I did after threading and tying on and starting to weave is I had to rearrange my heddles into different positions. On my other rigid heddle loom, which is a 24-inch, I have plenty of space to just have my third heddle hanging out at the back. But on the Sampleit loom, it's not just the space between the last heddle and the back beam, it's also the width. So the width of the heddle is actually wider than this section of the loom, and that becomes very challenging because you can't get that heddle into the positions that you want to. So the first thing that I did was I lifted the first heddle out of position. I slackened off the tension on the warp a little bit so that I can move things around as I want to. I took the second heddle and I moved it into the first position, and then I took my third heddle and moved it into the second heddle position. So now what I have is my first heddle hangs out at the front rather than my third heddle hanging out at the back, because there is more room here. Now, in particular, in front of the double heddle block right here, there are these 2 grooves on either side. It's a fairly small space, but it's just enough space to fit the wooden part of this heddle in so that I can lift that up and down within that space. If I try and do it here, I can't. But here, it works out perfectly. So that's the first thing to do, and then to remember that you are having the order of 1, 2, 3, and just to keep that in your mind that these are no longer heddles 1 and 2 here. It's 1, 2, 3. That's the first thing. So I'll tighten up my tension again now that I've got those heddles in place. And then also I've noticed as I've been weaving along in all the different heddle positions that I need to change the positions a little bit as well because of that lack of space. Let's go through the heddle positions that I'm using, and then I can be more specific. So the first heddle position I have is heddles 1 and 2 up. This is really tricky because if I try to put, let's say I would try to put heddle 2 up and leave heddle 3 in neutral in the back there. Okay, so I put heddle 2 up, heddle 3 stays in neutral, and then I try to lift heddle 1 up and it only goes to here. That is kind of enough to get my shuttle through. It makes a very small shed. So the correct threads are lifted, but for a newer weaver, especially if you're newer to weaving with 3 heddles and you're not so familiar with where threads should be or how things should be looking at any given time, that's kind of difficult. It's a very narrow shed right there. So what I've been doing instead is I will leave heddles 1 and 2 out of any position, so they're just free ranging there. And I actually lift the third heddle out of position as well and let it drop into the small groove that's right behind the second heddle block there. And so it just sits there. And then I grab my heddles 1 and 2 together and lift them up. And that gives me a much better shed, and I can see that all of the correct threads are lifted there. Okay, so that's the first position. That works much better. The second position is heddles 2 and 3 up. So I'm grabbing heddle 2, putting it up the top of the heddle block, heddle 3 up the top as well. And then heddle 1, I just make sure that it's sitting down as far as it can go, but it's still kind of just floating there. And that gives me a lovely big shed, no problems with that one at all. Another combination that I use is heddles 1 and 3 down. So let's have a look at that. So I'd be putting my heddle 3 into neutral. And this is cool because I can use the front of the double heddle block to put heddle 2 down, click into place. And then once that's clicked back into place, it gives me a bit of extra space to also put that heddle 1 down. And it just kind of sits there. It sits a little bit above heddle 2, but I can press it down. And then once again, I've got that lovely big shed to weave through. So that's good. And then the final position I'm using is heddles 2 and 3 down. So I grab my heddle 3, I pop it into the back of the slot there. Heddle 2, I've already got that down in that down position. And then what I can do is just lift my heddle 1 that's floating at the front there. And when I lift it, it's almost in like a neutral position, how it would be if I had it sitting in a neutral position. And so the shed is nice and clear there. So one of the real challenges that I've had with this particular warp is also the tension. I'm using an 8/2 cotton, which is notoriously difficult for tensioning on a rigid heddle anyway. So I've got shaft 1 threads threaded in holes, shaft 2 threads threaded in holes, shaft 3 threads threaded in holes, and shaft 4 threads threaded in slots. And it's the slots that present with the problems because the slot thread's always much looser than the hole threads. And so what I've done here at the back is I've employed quite a bit of wedging. Some of this I've just put underneath the entire warp like that. Some of it I've opened sheds, like opened some down sheds to expose those slot threads, and then pushed these separators in, and that has helped a lot. Another thing that I've been doing is obviously packing at the front beam, which really helps, but the tension is definitely a challenge. But as with any rigid heddle weaving, once you have your cloth going around the front beam and rolling onto itself, the tension really improves. So the challenge really with this sample that I'm doing right now, apart from the ones that I've already presented, is with the tension, to not have the tension so tight, because obviously if you've got looser slot threads, your inclination is to go, okay, I need to really tighten up my tension. But then once you tighten up your tension at the front, then if your heddles are really difficult to move into position, like say when I'm doing heddles 2 and 3, that it feels okay, but it almost feels too tight. Like if I did one more click to tighten that tension at the front, that would be too tight, and that'd be putting a terrible strain on my loom and my heddles and my threads. And so I've been trying to get this balance between over-tensioning and under-tensioning. And it's a bit tricky, but it is getting better as I weave. But you can see here, like when I move the heddles, that I have some quite loose threads. Thankfully, the weaving is looking quite good, and the tension doesn't seem to have affected it too much. I have weighted, you can hear the weights tingling over the back of the loom there. I've weighted some of the individual threads that I thought were particularly bad, and that has helped as well. So I hope these tips have been helpful to you. I do get a lot of questions about how to weave with 2, 3 heddles, and I have a lot of resources that I've made available to learn how to do this. It's not something that I can just give a straight answer to. If you ask me, how do I weave with 3 heddles? I'm like, well, where do I begin? I don't want to say it's really complex, because it's not. It's actually quite simple, but there are processes, there are techniques, there are methods. And these, I guess you could say, that learning it is a journey, not something that you just snap your fingers and go, okay, now I can do this thing. But as I said, I have a lot of resources and I'm going to link to some of them down below. I have, in particular, what I want to mention is an ebook that is all about converting 3 and 4 sharp drafts to your rigid heddle loom, and it includes templates and suggestions for ways that you could thread particular drafts, and I think it's super, super useful if this is what you want to get into with your rigid heddle weaving. So I'll leave a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. Many of my resources are either free or very affordable, and that is my commitment to the weaving world, to keep things as accessible as possible for everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time, I hope. And until then, happy weaving.